Thank you for attending this afternoon's X-Camera talk by artist Sorouja Moll. The artistic director of Inner Arts Matrix, Sheila McMath, has curated this virtual speaker series, and Inner Arts Matrix board member Chloe Blair will introduce Sorouja more fully in just one moment. But first, I'd like to welcome everyone here today. The X-Camera series began in the spring of 2019 when a group of people interested in the arts gathered at Fresh Ground Cafe / Common Studios in downtown Kitchener every Friday afternoon until March 2020 to hear a lecture by an interdisciplinary artist or professional. So the lectures were followed by a question and answer period, and then time for people to stay in the cafe space, eat lunch together, continue conversations, and to build a community. So it's in the spirit of supporting artists and building community that X-Camera has been relaunched virtually on Zoom and will continue on Fridays at 1 for the foreseeable future. So Sorouja will begin shortly and will speak until about 10 to 2. So we encourage you to engage in the chat by offering comments or questions as the lecture happens. We will have a Q&A at the end of the talk that focuses on Sorouja's work. Following this, we will open up the room for those of you who are able to stay past 2. We encourage you to do so, to introduce yourself, to let us know what you've been working on or potentially discuss future collaborations. So we're very pleased to have Sorouja here with us today. And we would like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which we gather is the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Métis peoples. We recognize the significance of the dish with one spoon covenant to this land. The dish with one spoon covenant is a peace agreement made between Indigenous nations before the Europeans arrived. It characterizes our collective responsibility to each other and to the earth, that we should only take what we need, leave enough for others, and keep the dish clean. So today, this gathering places home to many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, and acknowledging them reminds us of our important connection to this land where we live, work, and learn. Thank you.
All right, welcome everyone. It's my pleasure today to introduce Sorouja Moll. Sorouja has a PhD in as an interdisciplinary communication scholar, teacher, and artist. Her research creation practice undertakes an analysis of all forms of media, including adaptations of Shakespeare in Canada, and an intersectional approach to 19th century archival communication structures and their manifestations in, among other areas, nation, memory, and identity. Moll's current area of research includes durational meditations as an everyday practice in which transgression, enunciation, ambiguity, and emancipation can be explored through multimedia performance, site installation, photography, painting, creative writing, and research. As an award-winning author, Sorouja's writing has been profiled on CBC Radio and published in the Globe and Mail, Toronto Star, Canadian Theatre Review, as well as academic and literary journals and books. As a playwright and performance artist, Sorouja's work has been presented across Canada. That is a mouthful, Sorouja. Holy smokes. So I'm very, very pleased and excited to introduce you today, and I eagerly await your talk and watching you dazzle us all.
Thank you so much, Chloe. I really appreciate the introduction as well. So hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being present today to listen to and to share in a conversation about my new work, Solitary Series, 365 Days. It is a durational meditation of me witnessing the solitary across the first year of the pandemic. I would like to take this opportunity as well to thank everyone at Inner Arts Matrix, especially Chloe, just for the invitation and your support during the preparation. I'm really grateful for this opportunity. So the invitation also creates an opportunity for me to consider how the series does not arrive in a vacuum, but has a rhizomatic quality in that it emerges and surfaces with different yet deeply connected specific origins to my positionality. So before I begin to discuss the work directly, I will spend some time highlighting prior projects. At the root of each is what I begin to see as the invisible, in the sense of what is overwritten or obstructed by routinized and dominant norms of every day, and the colonial impact as well at micro, meso, and macro levels. The exploration continues with this project as I question how meaning is made through the representation of the solitary, both ontology as being and epistemology as knowing, and its potential to disrupt reductive preconceptions by identifying individual agency and experience that potentially form counter discourses, counter memory, and counter memorial. So the 5 different areas that I'll be looking at today are just the constellations, what I'm calling constellations in the sense of what could be seen as a highlight reel, just so you start to see this pattern that I observed as well in my former work toward the solitary series. I'll look then more specifically at the solitary series, just an overview of the work looking at different elements. I'll then begin to explore how the solitary is also a type of performance and what that means. And then how I've created, in a sense, a counter memorial as a pop-up in that it can be installed in different locations. And then I will conclude with examining my new work. Links to the video clips will be available on a reading list, and or we can discuss them after the talk. So this work, as with all my work, is in response to my genuine connection to the land upon which I live, work, and create. This location is embedded into my positionality. I identify as mixed race. My mother was Indonesian and my father was Dutch. I am the manifestation of a colonial intergenerational struggle. I actively locate myself and my privilege within contexts, histories, and presence on the land that I'm on. And for this project, it plays a significant role every morning at the water's edge of Lake Ontario, Treaty 13, which is also the land of Mississauga the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Chippewa, the Wendat peoples, but also the home of many different First Nation communities, Métis people, and Inuit. It is also the dish with one spoon, as Hannah had mentioned in her introduction, which is a covenant that was made among Indigenous nations, European settlers, and all newcomers with the promise to be caretakers of the land, water, and all beings. Among the ways I take on this responsibility of caretaking is through my teaching, nurturing of my relationships, and also my interdisciplinary research, creation praxis, which pursues creative and critical ways to make space for voices to be heard and stories to be told. So I've come to realize that my work is generative and that it continues to inform new work. So as a retrospective, I'm highlighting a few key projects: girls' work, writing names, Bridge, the Mushhole Project, Mad Meg, and Wild Yeast. Themes in all of these examine representation in public and private discourses and disrupt continuities or what is visible by identifying discontinuities or what is invisible. And they're exposed through a praxis of unsilencing, which is a type of making known. This aligns with what Diana Taylor would call artivism. And she looks at that through performance in public spaces. So the first work I'm going to look at is girls' work. So in 2007, Girls' Work was launched in conjunction with the Shakespeare Made in Canada Festival at the Art Gallery of Guelph. I wrote the play and it was co-directed with myself and Nigel Gow. The work confronted the exhibition with an intersectional interrogation of Shakespeare's representations of women and girls by adapting passages from various plays and weaving in my own personal writing, as well as research testimonies found in 19th century archives. For example, a figure of Augustine, who was a 14-year-old patient, and she was held against her will in a Paris asylum. She was forced to perform for international audiences as Ophelia, to demonstrate what hysteria looked like. Her recorded patient testimony made evident her experienced abuse and her resistance against the asylum director and doctor, Jean-Martin Charcot. The monologue, this particular monologue, was performed by Amanda Bronson, and an image of Augustine was projected in the gallery, and it was juxtapositioned with the Shakespeare portrait. Now, you'll see the Shakespeare portrait, and was on the first floor. It was like center of this particular exhibition that encompassed all 3 floors. What was interesting and of note is that we were told that we couldn't touch the barrier, and we especially could not go inside the barrier because that's what barriers are for. But of course we did, and as you can see one of the actors actually playing, and this became really central to the play itself. So the normalized valor that the figure of Shakespeare held in the space was interrogated, adapted, and rejected. Just going to take a drink of water. What remains with me from Augustine's testimony is her phrase, "The thing is fixed in the word." The phrase resonates throughout my work as I continue to critically examine how linguistic signifiers are foundational in systemic discrimination, as well as in our own sense of self, and how it is bound with constructed historical and present context and content. So the next work I'll look at is writing names. During this period, I was a researcher for the Canadian Adaptations of Shakespeare project out of the University of Guelph. And I began to do research on a play called The Fair Grit, an 1873 adaptation of Romeo and Juliet. Of interest to me was the playwright Nicholas Flood Davin. Davin was also the editor and owner of the Regina Leader newspaper, an MP, a poet, a playwright. He had his fingers in many pies. And on January 28, 1879, Davin was directed by John A. Macdonald to venture to Washington, D.C. with the mission to become, and I quote, "acquainted with the establishment, cost, and practical value of industrial schools among the Indian population in the United States." Davin submitted 13 recommendations to Macdonald. The Davin report became the template for the residential school system in Canada. Now, of interest, and particularly currently with Ryerson in the news, it's really, I think, important to take up a comparative analysis between Egerton Ryerson's 1847 Indian School Recommendation, which is pre-Confederation, and Davin's 1879 post-Confederation document. It's also really important to understand that there were many players and many corporations that are still around today that were involved in these institutions. So I became interested in the Davin report. So as I read it, what I realized is something was missing, something was invisible. And what it was were the Indigenous women of those particular areas and communities. And I began to think about the connection of the missingness of 19th century, in the 19th century policy with the contemporary statistic of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, which in 2008 was identified in the media as 520. After using the number over and over again in my research, I finally stopped and I asked, who are these women and girls? And the statistic is a colonial process of concision. It's one of reduction, but it's also one of negation. So I found the names, and using Sarah Stillman's media activism, which involves 3 elements: naming, archaeology, which is a type of research, and performance. And I wrote the names of the lives taken on the Montreal streets to make the public aware of what has been made silent. So the next project that I want to highlight is the Mushroom Project, and I'll just show you here. This is the the website, which is really comprehensive. And again, I will share this in a reading list. So when I arrived to Waterloo, I was invited to join a collective that was working on the Mushroom Project. The project set out to foster collaborations between Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities and work with and support the Woodland Cultural Center's Save the Evidence campaign. The project was curated as an immersive, site-specific art and performance installation held at the former residential school, the Mohawk Institute, which is in Brantford, Ontario. Its objective is to gain understanding and to share and acknowledge histories and contemporary issues and activate the space for knowledges, stories, and voices to be heard, remembered, and transformed. Now, the year before the Mushroom project happened, in 2015, I had reinstalled the Writing Names project. And I was working with the Waterloo Indigenous Student Center, and for 2016, I suggested that we use red ties instead of writing the names in chalk. And this would be paying homage to Jamie Black's work. But it was also a way to continue to individualize and honor each life by writing each name on the fabric as a counter memorial to make visible government and public silence. So I'll just show an image here. Again, there is a video component to this, but I have an image here of the 2020 installation. And what is interesting, due to COVID, we couldn't write the names this past year. So instead, we read the names, which encompass 1,500 names in terms of what I've been able to gather. There are many more. The numbers range up to almost 5,000. It's horrific. But what was interesting as well during this particular moment in terms of memorial is the affect generated by reading the names rather than just writing the names. So it's something that will possibly continue as we continue that particular installation. So Bridge Honoring the Lives of Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls and Two-Spirit People has become an annual installation since 2016. On the bridge that connects the campuses, and you'll see the bridge here, is held for 16 days. It's held in conjunction with 16 days of activism against gender-based violence. And during this time, particularly in 2019, and continuing with 16 days of activism, I also installed Mad Meg, Your Name in Domestic Violence. And this created a space in which community members reflected upon their connection to domestic violence, which is often silenced due to shame, grief, and fear. The title draws from the 14th century Peter Bruegel painting, which you'll see right here, Mad Meg or Dull Greet. The installation was located in a trailer. And I thought that this was interesting in terms of the paradox of mobility in the sense that you can leave, but you actually need support to leave. And so the installation, being located in the trailer, it became a place to witness the lives of those who were and are involved in this ubiquitous violent battle. Individuals were offered a wooden spoon, which is a symbol of the domestic, but was also a weapon. Mad Meg is carrying a bag here, which includes different utensils from the kitchen. And we can talk about that if you have a question about this particular image. But the general public, faculty members, students, the community at large, they were given a wooden spoon and they could write a symbol on the spoon or a name, anything that they would like to write on the spoon, and then plant it in what became a counter memorial, an area of counter memorial. And this was again raising awareness against the silence. So the final project I want to talk about, just in terms of leading up into the Solitary series, is Wild Yeast. So, and actually I'm just going to take another drink of water again. On day 3 of the lockdown in 2020, dry yeast disappeared from the grocery store shelves. I don't know if you were aware of this, but I couldn't believe it. And I come from a long line of bakers, so this was a big deal. So on day 4, I launched a wild yeast starter. On day 10, she tried to escape her glass mason jar container. At first, I was annoyed in the wake of the tidal-like spillage across my kitchen counter, but that quickly diminished when it dawned on me that I was witnessing a demonstration of will against sheltering in place, against being quarantined. The chemistry of wild yeast and its very symbiotic relationship with its molecular environment, it survives in its very refusal to be contained. It becomes itself through an orgasmic and messy egress of self-emancipation. Wild yeast is in the air, it's everywhere, and the imagined sense to capture the daughter cells belies its nature to resist captivity. The etymology of quarantine arrives from early 14th century Italian and Venetian nomenclature, describing the 40-day period that ships were forced to stay in port with its passengers during the Black Death plague. Entering the 16th century, the word was used in English demarcating the duration a widow could reside in her dead husband's house, which, as it turns out, is 40 days. So wild yeast is a durational meditation using digital media to surface the allegorical and intersectional configurations of the quarantine. So on March 14th, 2020, I was forced to stay inside, just like everyone else. So I, not unlike the yeast, left my container. One of the first questions I thought of and started to ask is, what does the solitary mean? And so in terms of its etymology, the word arrives from the mid-14th century, meaning alone or living alone. But then I also realized that there was a precursor to this. So an early eruption of the word is oneliness, which simply states being one. So solitude and oneliness at the time was not encoded as unhealthy or undesirable, but rather a necessary space for a reflection with God or to be in one's deepest thoughts. I then began to think too, like, what is the difference between solitary and loneliness? Like, why isn't this the loneliness series, 365 days? And so Amelia Worsley, in her 2015 essay, Ophelia's Loneliness, explains, a clue is found in Shakespeare, notably in Hamlet and in the folio edition of Hamlet, in which the first recorded use of the word loneliness is found. Significant is that it is also one of the earliest references to the concept in all of English literature. So I thought, whoa, this is actually kind of interesting, because instead of loneliness being attributed to Hamlet, it's linked to Ophelia. And while Hamlet speaks, he's seen as solitary. And Ophelia is silent, except for her mad songs, which are silenced and ignored. But within that, she's linked with loneliness. So here, dominant language codes stick and are encoded, decoded, and gendered. Worsley points out that the definition and genealogy of loneliness is split into 2 stages. A bodily condition until the 19th century, when it becomes a feeling or an emotion of dejection. So there's a really interesting exclusion that occurs. And this also appears in the play, where when loneliness is ascribed to Ophelia, she is separated out from the scene, and also, in a sense, made guilty. I'm just going to move out. I get lost in my prezzies. So in seeing these solitary figures, what came to mind was Caspar David Friedrich's Wander Above the Sea Fog, and its lesser known Woman Before the Setting Sun. So Friedrich was an early 19th century German romantic landscape painter, often contrasting nature as the sublime against the figure of man. For example, on versions of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, you'll see this image. What's also interesting is the compositional framing continues to service of Western colonial tropes of terra nullius, What's also interesting, when you begin to do a comparative analysis, The Woman Before the Rising Sun was done just a year after this particular image. And so the question is, why do I know this image and not this image? And that's a question for myself as well. So solitary can be described through various intersectional discourses, such as empirical, rhetorical, aesthetic, political, nation, domestic, inclusion, exclusion, et cetera, et cetera. So with the solitary series, I'll just go back to the full slide. I begin to consider the power of signifiers, fixing, stabilizing, encoding ideological constructions that shape ontologies, being, and epistemologies, knowing, which inform identity, agency, and constraint, as well as boundaries, nation states, sovereignties, belonging, unbelonging, but also, importantly, resistance and refusal. So now what I'll do is I'll run a sample of images from the project, from the solitary series. The duration is an hour and it encompasses the 365 days. And then I will talk more specifically over it as it's running. I'll just make it full screen here. So as Michel Foucault suggests, perhaps transgression is like a flash of lightning in the night, which, from the beginning of time, gives a dense and black intensity to the night it denies, which lights up the night from inside, from top to bottom, yet owes to the dark the stark clarity of its manifestation, its posed singularity. So I begin with Sylvia Plath from her 1962 radio play, Three Women. I am as solitary as grass. What is it I miss? Shall I ever find it, whatever it is? On March 14th, 2020, the morning following the official lockdown, I emerged from my East End Toronto neighborhood, cut across Queen Street, and walked along Coxwell to Lakeshore. The boulevard's usual acceleration of discontented traffic was apocalyptically still. So I crossed on a red and headed along the tree-lined pathway toward Ashbridges Bay. Between the budless maples and huddled evergreens, small windowed openings shimmered the crest of Lake Ontario under the rising sun. Landing on the beach's wide swath of sand, I approached the early morning shoreline. The sky was an ironic blue as it touched a horizon of wakeless water. Along my path, I picked up a lone stone that caught my eye. A stone of exception, I thought, a figurative keepsake and play on words for the state of exception the government had thrown its citizens into. As I walked beside the water's edge on the otherwise abandoned beach, I spied a figure, like me and Plath, solitary. Cast into silhouette and anonymous in the sun's eastern rise, the figure looked out into the mocking blue as if waiting for a bus, or waiting for some sign gesturing towards things to come. Instead of Plath, the wanderer above the sea fog comes to mind. Caspar David Friedrich's 1818 painting captures in oil and canvas the romantic style of his period. Friedrich's iconic subject stands solitary with his back to the viewer upon a rocky precipice against a cloud-piled sky. The wanderer has gained a reputation as a metaphor for an unknown future. Friedrich's compositional placing of his subject's back toward the observer is known as Rückenfigur, an artistic device that's borrowed from the German term turned figure. The figurative play creates an illusion of space, an imagined yet unseen and undisclosed perspective, and a witnessing of self, watching like an elusive shadow. Rückenfigur becomes a kind of staging ground, an open place or acting platform where persona and shadow selves meet. As early as the 14th century, Italian artists painted figures with their backs to viewers. Since then, Rückenfigur as a tactic is featured in the work of Man Ray, Edvard Munch, Salvador Dali, Norman Rockwell, to name a few. As an early morning observer of shoreline pedestrians, I try to see, suppose, empathize with the turned figures on the shore. And I realize I too am solitary. Are we both thinking about the pandemic or just about the waves and how they circle and retreat and circle and retreat, a stubborn stone on the shore like a reluctant embrace, or how a resting cormorant warms her open wings under the rise of a yellow sun and appears like a superhero, or how am I going to pay my hydro bill, or are you okay, or will I ever see you again? The fascination of the solitary figure has a long philosophical and literary history with such figures as Nietzsche, Emerson, Woolf, Thoreau, Whitman, et al. Aristotle likened the solitary to a god. Public sculptures mark spaces where water meet land with monuments like Les Voyageurs in Marseille, for instance, which evokes memories of travelers and the parts of themselves they leave behind. The Little Mermaid on the Denmark shore by Edvard Eriksson depicts a mermaid's wait to be human. Rachel Mosley, in her book Woman at the Edge, considers the gendered significance in the representations of the haunting figure of the woman on a coastline's perilous edge at moments of transition and profound social change. So at dawn each morning, I walked to the edge of Lake Ontario shoreline. I photographed and witnessed the witnesses of change. I retrieve a stone to mark the day and document these passing moments. With my found stone, I also discover metaphors, singular yet connected, testaments to time, the change ever changing with the demanding ingress and egress of waves. We are all each small monuments, proof I was once here. This time will be remembered in each of us. This time when gathering, touching, embracing will never be the same, differently. In solitude, and each and every one of us holds stories that mark this unstable ground, shifting in shadow and stone and in ourselves. With faces turned toward the rising day, the shoreline, wherever one might find it, is an open place where shadows and selves meet to contemplate the unknown and how the sun, sky, wind, and waves continue nevertheless. A place where grief, love, fear, hope, and transformation arrive and retreat. Standing solitary among one another, looking toward the horizon, I recall Plath's blade of grass. And like the sky, water, shore, we are also bound to one another regardless. And we are, as Plath states, on the precipice of the yellow minute before the wind walks. So my observations so far, because this is something that is in process of the work, has come up with a few things that I'll just talk about as I let the images roll. The language of the normal. On a visible level or a manifest discourse, the pandemic's response created a discontinuity in what was a continuity of status quo across sectors in different ways. The year 2020 and into 2021 was and is a period of sequestered states at micro, meso, and macro levels, and come with the desire to return to the normal or the corrective new normal. Revised linguistic codes were issued with temporal horizon lines such as moving forward, looking ahead, next phases, when will this be over, in 12 weeks' time, another 12 weeks' time, maybe next year, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Language codes redesigned collective continuities that move the we, a varied use of the collective pronouns with their own cases of exclusions, out of the present and into an unknown future. However, against this are, and this is what this project explores, singular and variant behavior, which often remains invisible. So variant behavior and individual affect of that is part of the breaking the lockdown, the seeking open space, make, in their very creation, singular acts of resistance in multivariant ways. Homie Bobby explains that affectivity, including fear, ambivalence, terror, shame, disorientation, and or dispossession. And I'll just add to this catalog, love, joy, faith, celebration, All of these things figure prominently in addressing the singular identification with or to the resistance of change. So affect registers and regulates the individual ambivalent and anxious responses as they face what is new, partially known, or without guarantees. But at the same time, it provides the agent with an imminent sense of sensory and bodily attentiveness to the task of change. So this space is never stable. And with the daily photographs themselves, so each photograph, the continuity of the photograph is broken by the layered discontinuity of what the image actually means and what the agent or subject in that particular image is thinking, feeling, or seeing. So this led me to pause. I pause a lot, think a lot, and consider my impulse, like what drew me to this. And then I immediately came to the duende. So in 1933, Federico Garcia Lorca used the concept of the duende in his writing, and it's borrowed from, among others, a Spanish and Portuguese folklore. The duende, or the ghost, is what ignites artistic practice. Lorca explains, the duende then is a power, not a work. It's a struggle, not a thought. I have heard an old maestro of the guitar say, the duende is not in the throat. The duende climbs up inside you from the soles of your feet, meaning this. It is not a question of ability, but of true living style, of spontaneous creation. So here I return to the Rückenfigur, or the turned figure, on the precipice of social change. And I realize that I could not see and cannot see what that solitary figure was seeing, even while standing on the same horizon line, or looking at the same horizon line. I would never have their perspective of the sky while standing on the same shoreline or within their space of ambiguity. So the space of ambiguity, which Homi Bhabhi calls the third space, locates the uniqueness of each person or context as a hybrid. Also, the shoreline itself presents itself as a space in between. It's neither here nor there, it's always changing. This is a liminal space, or a location of ambiguity, and again, never stable, and again, experienced differently. The shoreline is both material, but also figurative. Each individual experiences their own shorelines, for example, Zoom meetings, standing in a doorway, waiting in line for a vaccine, the space between a desired embrace, etc., etc. Thus, the continuity of the binary opposition, here versus there, past versus future, sanitized, unsanitized, etc., are all challenged and overruled. The collective we and the temporal push forward are, even for a moment, suspended with the transgressive gesture of the now, and or perhaps without the use of any language. Here also I began to think about the Rashomon effect, named after Akira Kurosawa's 1950 film. It is a phenomena that while we might collectively experience and witness a specific event, each of our testimonies of this period, while plausible, will always be unalike. We will remember the same thing differently. In this sense, individual positionality, whether we're witnessing or we're the subject, remains undisclosed fully. It is a constant action of critical reflection because our shorelines change, and so do we. And this brings me back to positionality, which requires the locating of one's self critically. Where am I standing? How did I arrive here? Why does this have meaningfulness to me? What are the historic and present confluences? For example, how are the indigenous lands overwritten by landmarks such as the Ludi Lifeguard Station? And you'll see that small building in some of the photographs. It was built in 1920. The building itself was nearly collapsed into Lake Ontario by the waves in 2017. Yet again, how do these same spaces become overwritten again and again and again by present forms of encroachment, resistance, and activism? For example, you might see in one of the photographs, BLM was written on the lifeguard station. So what is the breadth and depth of the palimpsest? And by palimpsest, I mean what has been overwritten. And an example of that would be a painting that perhaps the artist didn't like, and they would paint over it. But that painting would always, the former painting would always be there, and it would always reemerge somehow. So then also considering the impossibility to remove what has been, even when it is invisible. So considering the colonial linguistic paradigms or linguistic hegemony that are encoded across long history through such mediated vehicles as repetition, reduction, capitalism, Shakespeare was one example, singularity tests hegemonic codes of collective states that demand the relinquishing of the sovereign being. So it's important to begin questioning what is the opening through which interest operates? How do we give ontologies power? What is at stake? So thus, 365 days, this project becomes a document, a counter-memorial to represent, to remember, to reflect each solitary being's singularity and the embodied individual experiences and transgressions that took place at the ever-shifting shoreline over the course of the first year of the pandemic, and how spaces of ambiguity potentially empower counter-hegemonic and radical movements. So now I'll just pause the slideshow. And one of the things that I started to also think about, obviously, again, I do a lot of thinking. Let me just go back to home so I can get to that easily. I began to think about how the solitary performs, and specifically to the subjects that I was witnessing. So borrowing from Diana Taylor, performance offers a way to transmit knowledge by means of the body, with the caveat that performance, even when understood strictly as live art, is always mediated. Works function within systems of representation, and the body is one more media that transmits information and participates in the circulation through gestures and images. So with this project, I'm interested in what the solitary body as media transmits as an unconscious or conscious performance using ontologies and epistemologies. Again, the being and what that being knows, as well as all the surrounding elements. So the following three elements are part of the Solitary Series 365 Days multimedia installation. And so they involve the subject, the solitary figure, which are the photographs, and the projection of the photographs, the videos of the shoreline, which I took over the course of the 365 days, and the stones, of which 365 stones are actually right behind me as I speak right now. So I'll begin with just, again, looking at the subject on the shoreline and thinking about how I am witnessing a form of performance. Moreover, I began to consider how does the individual witness, consciously or not, their own performance at their many shorelines. So how do we perform each day? And how does that change as well? And what do we consider as being solitary or not? And how is that then performed? The next element is the shoreline, and I'll just show this briefly. This actually, again, runs for an hour, and this is just a section of it. So the shoreline itself, as well as another element, performs in ways because it's mediated, in the sense that it's controlled and it's constrained by the wind, the weather, the season, whether or not someone threw a Tim Horton cup in the water, whether or not there's a harbor wall there, canals, even the shoreline itself is a form of constraint. So how does your particular shoreline perform? And next, I just want to also then look at the stones themselves. So the stones, I liken them to found poems in the sense that they each are so different. And I really began to think about stones and how they are different. And so every day I selected one, and I did this on impulse. And it was really to mark each day that we were put into a state of exception or emergency. And here it's handy to reference Carl Schmitt or Giorgio Agamben, which talks specifically about the state of emergency, sovereignty, and the philosophical tendencies around that. There's 4 instances in Canada that citizens were put into state of emergency. One was World War I, where Germans and Italians were interned. World War II, the Japanese were interned. The October crisis in Quebec, and then the 2020 pandemic. So the stones became 365 daily markers. Each stone is different. Each stone demonstrates and shows in some ways, but not always, its journey and its constitution. It appears fixed, but it is ever-changing. And what I began to notice is when I take photographs and I'd see a solitary figure, the stones standing in parallel, there was really interesting kind of figurative play between the stone and the solitary figure on the shoreline. One detail around the stones that happened, I would often find stones with holes in it. I don't know if you can see that. So, I'd find a stone and I think, hey, the stone has a hole in it, and it would be put it on the pile, and it would not register anything. And then a friend of mine said, oh, that's a hagstone. And I thought, oh, what's that? And so the hagstone, it's also called the adderstone. And as it turns out, it's a rare and apparently extremely magical stone because it's tumbled through the tides of time and winds, and over time has created a naturally occurring hole in it. And this is actually known across many different cultures, and it's considered to be powerful for its protection. It has for good luck, for good health. Apparently, if you spit through the center and throw it over your shoulder, you get money. If you look through it, you can see the land of fairy. There's all these different things. And I thought, that's really interesting. And so now I have a hagstone hanging in my house. But again, pausing, I thought, wow, this is really interesting how, again, you can change the ontology of a stone by changing how you encode it. So a stone, 1 minute, that was just a stone, becomes something that is powerful. And I thought, wow, that in itself is powerful and really important to understand how we attribute meaning to things and how that changes the ontology, the being, the epistemology, the knowing of something. So all of these things have come together as a multimedia installation, and this installation all of these elements will come together at an exhibition at the Tom Thompson Gallery in Sound in April 2022. And it will encompass multimedia in the sense that there'll be the projection of the images, the photographs, the videos of the shoreline that I recorded over the 365 days, as well as the 365 stones that I borrowed from the beach will be placed on the gallery floor. The work itself will be in conversation with artist Ray Johnson's work, specifically my video Red Mitten on White Snow, which is a video that I did. Dave Milner did the camera work on this, and it's called Red Mitten on White Snow, and it's a reflection on individual grief, and particularly during a period when people were suffering many unknown and unrecognized losses. So an offshoot from this project already has been what I'm calling Rückenfigur 365 days. And one of the reasons why I shifted the name is because I wanted to focus more directly on the turned back and what potentially that could mean in terms of other meanings and other interpretations. So it's developed with the photographs only. And originally, when I did the test projection of it, and this is the Ludi Lifeguard Station at Q Beach, my partner said, why don't you have music to this? And so I thought, I'm concerned about that because music can change everything in terms of meaning. So I I contacted my brother, who's a musician, Edward St. Moritz, and I said, hey, you know, would you like to do music to this? And so what this has created in terms of this pop-up is a parallel story, a parallel narrative, in the sense that musically and with sound is an expression of his own experiences as a solitary during the 365-day period. So again, the first pop-up took place at the Ludi Lifeguard Station. And what's interesting here is that here on this landmark is yet another overwriting of an overwritten history and histories. Also, I'm open if you have ideas around other locations, because I will be installing this pop-up in different locations around Toronto and Montreal. And so I'm open to ideas and invitations around that. And again, there is a video, and this is available too on YouTube, and I'll make it available on the reading list. So as I conclude, I just want to talk a little bit about some new work that I'm starting to venture into. And truthfully, to be honest, like on day 366, I kind of fell into a little bit of mourning. It was just like, what am I going to do now? My schedule, my structure was gone. So I decided, you know what, I'm going to take a new path, literally a new path, in the sense of instead of going east, I'm going to go west. And so I then started to think about the solitary figures and naming them, or identifying, attributing solitariness to them. And so I was doing a lot of painting of the solitary figures on the shoreline. And I started to think, well, what if it was path rather than solitary? And again, I started to consider the power of language to determine states of being, but also the grammar, in the sense that path is a noun. And so disrupting the fixed linguistic container of path, I started to think about all the different formations of the verb, the precursors to path, in the sense that some action had to be created to create that path. And even the sense of going on a path, there'd have to be some action towards that. So here the transgression, enunciation, ambiguity, and emancipation can be continued to be examined in often overlooked and invisible everyday paths, again using photography, performance painting, creative writing, and research. And interestingly, the etymology of the word path is a mystery. So for me, that's actually a really great place to begin the work. So that's the conclusion of my talk. Thank you so much for listening, for being here. I really appreciate it. Again, as I mentioned, I will be supplying a reading list from works that I referenced, but also with provided links. Also, feel free to check out my website. And yeah, and if anyone wants to talk about collaborations or invitations or anything like that, I'd be more than happy to share my email. So thanks very much.